Welcome to a dialogue on accountability in the digital age. A dialogue with representatives of a global, multi-stakeholder community.
And I'm your host, Frits Bussemaker, and today I'm delighted and privileged to have a conversation with Latha Reddy. Latha, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Frits.
Allow me to introduce who Latha is. You are the co-chair of the Global Commission on Stability in Cyberspace. Not only that, you are a former Deputy National Cybersecurity Advisor of India. You were involved in several organizations and think tanks, both globally and India. Former ambassador, former diplomat. You call yourself a warrior for cyber peace. A lot to talk about, Latha. And again, welcome to the program.
Now, thank you so much, Frits. I think we're fellow warriors in the cause of cyber peace, because that was the theme on which we spoke when I was in the Netherlands and at The Hague. And, I certainly would be happy to share my experiences and to share a little bit of my journey, how I got interested in this subject and why I feel so passionately about it.
That sounds like a very good opener for our discussion. So take us along. We're going to end with your role as the co-chair of the Commission for Cybersecurity. But please, where did it all start for you?
Well, Frits, it all started when I was appointed as the Deputy National Security Advisor of India. The National Security Council falls under the purview of the Prime Minister's office in India. And when I joined as the deputy, the then National Security Advisor, Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon, told me that he was very worried about cybersecurity in India. And this was in 2011, so about 11 years ago. And he asked me to take a look at what was happening exactly on cybersecurity, what were the responsibilities between various arms of the Indian government, and how are we dealing with it, and what should we be doing? It was a very big task.
Okay. And may I ask, what were your qualifications at the time that people said, you are going to be the ideal person for this job?
Well, I think the real issue was we had a lot of technical experts, right, in the Ministry of Information Technology and Electronics, which went by the interesting acronym in those days of deity, D-E-I-T-Y, okay, which means a god or a divine being. And perhaps internet had become the new god in our lives, and that stood, so essentially, the problem was not of technical expertise. The problem was of coordination and getting people to talk to each other, filling the gaps where there were gaps, avoiding overlaps where there were overlaps, and trying to come up with one coordinated response to the problem of how to keep cyberspace safe, for all the users, for all the citizens of India, and definitely for the sensitive government departments and others who would have to use cyberspace. So when I started on this journey, it was difficult because there were several agencies involved. Obviously there was the deity itself, the Department of Electronics and Information Technology. There was the Home Ministry that dealt with cyber crime. There was the Foreign Ministry that dealt with international negotiations, particularly in the United Nations. And there were also beginning to be very serious talks in the Commerce Ministry and others about how do we deal with the question of e-trade or cyber trade or cyber trade issues that are thrown up by the goods and services in information technology. So, and then there were the armed forces who obviously had their own requirements for keeping sensitive defense equipment safe. So there were there was the Space Research Agency, there was the nuclear establishment in India. All of them had to be involved in some way or the other. And most important, we had to involve the private sector as well. So the question was, how did we do all this? And what we came up with, I can speak about that
Yes.
if you like,
Yes.
is what were the different mechanisms we chose to address each of these issues. So coming first to how we interacted with the private sector, because I think that was an interesting thing, because it was the first time perhaps in India that there was a very serious conversation between national security personnel and the people in the private sector on how do we preserve this particular area of national security, how do we keep cyberspace safe. And what we did was we set up a joint working group with 10 agencies represented from the government and 10 agencies from the private sector. It's very difficult because, as you know, in the government, there is a feeling that you cannot be selective and choose only one company. You have to effectively interact with a variety of companies. So what we chose to do was to use the industry associations. For instance, we have an association called NASCOM, which is the National Association of all the industries dealing with information technology, data, all these other issues.
Makes sense.
And then we have the major trade associations, which would have a particular committee dealing with cyber and information technology, cybersecurity and information technology. So we had like the Confederation of Indian Industries, we had the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, we had the mobile telephone industry of representatives, we had people from all over, we had the Data Security Corporation of India, which is run again by the private sector, and so on. So we had 10 people from the private sector, we had 10 departments of the government. And in order to make it clear that this would be a collaborative effort, I suggested we had two co-chairs, myself as the co-chair on the government side, and the head of the Data Security Corporation of India, who was from the private sector, Dr. Kamlesh Bajaj, as my co-chair.
Got it.
And they were very happy with this, the industry, because they felt it gave them an equal say, at least in the outcome of these discussions and this report. At the end of 3 months of very intensive discussions, we came up with a list of what we felt that the private sector and the government could do together. Some of them have been implemented, some of them not.
Yeah.
And at that time, there was a request as to why we were not involving academia, why we were not involving civil society.
That question was already on my mind, to be honest.
Yeah. And the question was that we had to start somewhere, right? So we would start with the private sector, with the industry that had a vital stake in this matter. And then the idea was that it would gradually expand. And I found that my colleagues in the telecom ministry, telecommunications ministry, as well as in the deity, were very open to the idea of putting out draft policies, calling for public comment on draft policies. And I thought that was a very good way to go, because it meant that the general public was allowed to comment on any draft policy that the government put out that would have any bearing on telecommunications and information technology. And so I think that this was a useful exercise, and we were able to release a report which was very well received. And then the second part of it was, how did we coordinate within the government? So again, with a lot of help from my technical colleagues in the technology expert colleagues in the other departments, we held our own internal meetings with the different departments of the government. I had to have individual meetings with each body to understand what they were doing, and eventually expanded to group meetings, where smaller group meetings, and try to build an architecture where it was clearly described which arm of the government would be responsible for which area of cybersecurity.
Got it. What I'm really picking up from this whole discussion so far, Latha, is In order to get things moving, you need to
Yeah.
collaborate with a number of stakeholders. And one of the solutions which I like is the whole co-chair approach, making certain that one is not more that we have this Orwellian, they don't end up in this Orwellian situation. One is more equal than the other. All are equal, so we have co-chairs.
Yeah.
And is this example also the reason why the Global Commission on the Stability in Cyberspace also has co-chairs?
Well, actually, that's an interesting question, Fritz, because when we started the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, the idea was not that we would have two co-chairs. The idea was that there would be a chairperson, who would be Marina Kaljurand, who, as you know, is a great champion of cybersecurity, and a great spokesperson also for it. But she would be the chairperson, and there were two co-chairs to assist her, essentially. And the idea was that the chairperson and one of the co-chairs would have to be present for every meeting of the Global Commission, because it was clear that not all of us could be there for all the meetings. So the two co-chairs were myself, with my background, and then Michael Chertoff, who was the U.S. Secretary for Homeland Security, the former U.S. Secretary for Homeland Security. So essentially, what we had was Europe. You had myself, perhaps representing the global South and India itself, and then you had Michael talking about US, which was obviously a very vital player in this whole question when you discuss it. What happened was 1 year down the line, Marina had to resign from the chairmanship because she became a member of the European Parliament. And under the rules of the European Parliament, she could not chair such a body.
Yeah.
So what eventually happened was we ended up with two co-chairs. And between Michael and myself, we tried to both be there for all the meetings, but wherever one of us was, it was not possible, the other one would take over. And sometimes when you had meetings that were largely in the US, it made a lot of sense for Michael to do that. And when the meetings were in Asia, sometimes I chaired it. But most of the time, I would say we did a great job of collaborating and co-chairing it together. There was never any friction between us.
Okay.
We were very much on the same page because we both came from similar backgrounds of having been in the government, but having also experience of being outside government.
Well, what I like about this discussion, Latha, is we're not necessarily talking about the content of cyberspace or civilian cyber itself, but it's also how you organize the discussion and make certain that it gets traction, which is just as relevant as having discussion as well.
I agree. And that's why, the composition of the Global Commission was very important for us. And we drew experts. There were, of course, people from 17 countries, which was a good cross-section of the world. There were people from Asia, there were people from Africa, there were people from Europe, there were obviously people from America. But the question was that many of us came from very different backgrounds. You had real technology experts. You had people from the industry. You had people who organized black hat marathons like Jeff Moss. You had a lot of people with government experience, and of course in the US system and the European system, it's common to have people who have both been in government and in private sector. In Asia, that's not so common. But if from Asia also, we had a good cross section. We had people from Japan, we had people from India, we had people from, and not just myself from India, but you had Samir Saran from the Observer Research Foundation. They've got a terrific cybersecurity program. And you had, as I was saying, spread over all the continents, really. We had people from Latin America as well. And, I think that the combination of people from different backgrounds, different societies, different countries with different needs, developing countries, developed countries, was very, very important, because
Yeah,
That
no,
was really something we had to come to terms with.
okay, because we're talking about a global issue, so you need the global community at the table. But now this brings me to a topic related to how to organize the discussion and talk about solutions. Is with so many people at the table, how time consuming are the discussions, and how can you speed up things? Because one of the big issues with accountability in a digital age is that the legal and regulatory framework cannot keep up with. So how do you deal with such a global multi-stakeholder community as you just described with all its benefits? And how do you then keep the pace in the discussion to keep up with what's happening?
I think, what helped us was having the technology experts on board, because they would be able to tell us what were the latest developments. They would be able to tell us. We had people who belong to really to the technical bodies that oversee the internet, for instance. And we were very clear. Unlike the Global Commission on Internet Governance, which tended to take a very generalist view of things, it was a great commission. It was the first experiment of its kind, where we set up a global commission that had people from government, from outside government, from different backgrounds. Some of us were common to both the commissions,
Okay.
some of the members. Carl Bildt was a wonderful chairman. He was the chair of the first commission. And, I think
Former Prime Minister of Norway, I believe.
That's right, for Sweden.
Yeah,
He
Sweden,
was
so
the
Sweden,
former
yes.
prime minister and the former foreign minister as well of Sweden. And again, a great, great advocate of how we should be dealing with cyber issues. Very knowledgeable and a great negotiator. And so there, we came up with a whole slew of recommendations because it was the first ever time. So when it came to the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace, we very strictly restricted ourselves. We said we will not go all over the place. We will draw up some guiding principles.
Yeah.
We will essentially talk about the framework within which we're going to work. We're not going to get into content. We're not going to get into other issues. We are going to talk about how do you keep the actual nuts and bolts of the system, the actual internet, and the actual tools of cyberspace functional.
Okay.
How do you prevent damage to that infrastructure?
Hey, this brings me to another question, which I should have asked earlier. But what is your charter, or what was the charter or the mandate? Why would people, why would organizations, why would governments listen to the Global Commission?
Well, I think for one thing, because we had no particular axe to grind. We were not espousing a particular ideology. We made it clear that we were building on the work of many organizations that had come before us, and hopefully adding to the body of work that would be available for others. We made it also clear that the norms and recommendations which we came up with would essentially be available for everybody to pick and choose. If we were not offering a package where we said, either you accept in toto what we have recommended or you reject it. We said, pick and choose. Whatever makes sense to you, take that norm and run with it. And that's exactly what happened, because when we released it at the Paris Peace Forum, in 2019, the whole exercise started in 2016, but it got over in 2019, whereas the first Global Commission ran from 2014 to 2016. So it was almost a 5-year period of back-to-back 2 Global Commissions. And I think that what we were encouraged by was the Paris Peace Forum itself, either directly or indirectly, took on many of our norms when they talked about cyber issues. So that meant that the whole process of what I call cross-fertilization between organizations was happening, which is what we hoped would happen, right? And similarly, we made it clear that we were building on the work not just of private bodies like ours, but also on what had been discussed in the UN. We involved the UN Open-Ended Working Group chairman and the UN GGE, the governmental group of experts, in our discussions. They came and addressed our group many times. They told us about their work. We told them about our work. And they were very interested in some of the ideas which we had put forward. And I know that some of these concepts, maybe not the specific norms that we had proposed, the concepts were discussed in the UN, by both these groups. And I myself was invited to the open-ended working group to speak to them about the work of the Global Commission and why we felt we could in some way assist the global community, the governments. And, of course, there were all the usual hesitations about sovereign governments not wanting to give an equal voice to civil society and so on and so forth. But in spite of that, we got our point across. And till today, I'm in touch with UNIDIR. I'm in touch with a lot of the UN organizations. And we do exchange views on these matters because they could see that we were anxious to share our point of view and we were not trying to really be prescriptive in our approach. We were not saying you have to do this. We were just saying, here is what we found from our discussions.
Okay, so
take what you find valuable.
So what I'm hearing is a couple of success factors in this global discussion, proposing co-chairs, being agnostic, being content-driven. Those are the things which help to get where you want to go.
That's right. I think you have to lay down your principles first. What are you trying to achieve, right?
Yeah.
Secondly, you have to build a framework and say we're going to work within this framework. Thirdly, you have certain guiding principles, and then fourthly, you come up with your norms, which you hope that everybody will subscribe to. And we made it very clear. We said our norms will apply to states and to non-state actors. If you look at our report, which is available on cyberstability.org, that's the website. It is very clear that in every norm we say states, state actors and non-state actors. Sovereign states as well as non-state actors should do this, should do that, shouldn't do this, shouldn't do that. So, we are clear that that the governments are not the only ones with roles to play. Everybody has to play by the rules of the game. And then finally, we came up with 5 or 6 recommendations. And one of them was, of course, that we felt that there should be some kind of mechanism where discussions continued. We didn't really say where it should be located or how it should be located. But I think having a conference, a multi-stakeholder platform is very, very important. Now, whether eventually that becomes IGF Plus or whether it becomes some other organization, whether it becomes the Paris Peace Forum, or whether it's a UN-led forum, is a matter for the actual stakeholders to decide. But we felt this was very important. And a little later, if we have time, I'd like to talk to you about why I'm very upset about what's going on in the world today and why I feel that idea of having a universal platform is under so much threat.
Latha, we are at the end of the discussion, so by all means, share your concerns there, because I think that's, I'm assuming, a very valuable lesson and insight.
I'll tell you what I'm worried about, Fritz. I think the fact that we are retreating into small, like-minded groups is really, for me, it shows a move towards fragmentation, which is what we always wanted to avoid. Because when the geopolitical issues start coming in and you have these clearly defined blocks of what Russia and China want, what the US and Europe wants, and a large number of the developing world countries are somewhat torn between who to choose, what to do. I wouldn't say all, but many of us. The question then comes up as how do we build a universal agreement, and that universal agreement seems to be getting further away rather than closer. There was a time when we could all discuss different approaches in a civil manner. I think civil discourse has broken down. There is a lot of preconceived ideas. There's a lot of retreating into very, how shall I put it, rigid positions of this is bad and that is good and so on. And people seem to have just given up on the idea of reaching any kind of universal consensus. And for me, that's a tragedy.
I understand your observations. Are you optimistic about, can we change that course to it's becoming a universal discussion again?
Not in the near future. I think it'll take a long time for the scars of all that has been said and done in the last few years, particularly with the Russia-Ukraine question and on the China's growing power and aggression. All these things have really put people at loggerheads with each other. So I don't see in the short term much grounds for optimism. But perhaps in the long term, when the new world order, whatever it is, comes into being, because at the moment, I think we're going through a period of great turmoil, because accepted leaders of the world economy are no longer the accepted leaders. New leaders are emerging. New blocks of political allegiances are emerging. So with all of this happening, I think we'll have to wait for the dust to settle before we can go back in a meaningful way to discussions on a universal cybersecurity program that all countries will agree to. And but hope springs eternal, Fritz. And so I'm by nature an optimist. So I would say in the long term, yes. In the short term, I have my doubts.
Fair point. Last question then. What should we be doing today? What should we be doing in the meantime to deal with that question? How do we keep people accountable in this digital age?
I think for one thing, we need to develop better tools to find out who is behind attacks, rather than just automatically blaming the person with whom you may be in political opposition. I think we have to create a real system of accountability. You have to create a real system of consequences. And you have to create, I would say, proper channels of dialogue where no matter what is happening on other fronts, because, this is a global system. It's like the global financial system. If we don't talk to each other, the global financial system will break down. If we don't talk to each other, the global trading system will break down. If we don't talk to each other, the global cyber system will break down. Global cyberspace will break down. So dialogue, I think, and perhaps that's because of my diplomatic background, I've always believed that keeping the channels of communication open is perhaps the most important thing. And no matter what is going on other fronts, when we stop talking to each other, is when we are in really serious trouble.
Latha, those are very wise words we should keep in our minds. Unfortunately, we have to stop talking for this particular interview, but I'm certain your words and your thoughts will resonate. And let's keep the dialogue open, because you've pointed out we really need that. And I want to thank you so much for taking us along about a governance model for having this global conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And as you know, it's my passion, my personal passion. So I always love talking about how we can make cyberspace safer for all of us. Thank you.